I remember the exact moment the air turned cold. Not in the way weather shifts, but the way a room reacts when something unseen decides to notice you. And as I stood in that abandoned corridor with my recorder blinking red against the darkness, I realized I had crossed a threshold I wasn't prepared for, because the shadows weren't behaving like shadows anymore, and the walls carried a faint vibration like a whisper pressed against the skin rather than the ear, and every instinct I had trained over. Years of investigative work told me to walk away, yet something heavier than curiosity kept my feet rooted to the dusty floor, while the smell of burnt copper drifted past me in a place where nothing should have been burning at all, and each step I took deeper into that hallway felt like a step into a memory that wasn't mine, because I could sense, almost physically, that someone, or something, had walked this path moments before I entered, even though every logical measure said the building had been sealed for decades. And as my flashlight's beam jittered across peeling paint and collapsed beams, I kept thinking about the client's last words to me before I arrived here, the way she gripped my sleeve with trembling fingers and said that if I reached the heart of the building, I would understand what had taken her brother, and why no one else was willing to touch the case. And now, with the sound of my own breath echoing too loudly, I felt the truth of her warning pressing in on me, because I could hear footsteps ahead, slow, deliberate, unhurried, like they belonged to someone aware I was listening. And when I called out asking who was there, my voice didn't travel forward, it folded inward, as if the corridor swallowed it whole, leaving only a thin quiver in the silence. And then a door at the far end shifted, not opening, not closing, just shifting, as if nudged by a hand that had no weight, and the beam of my flashlight trembled over a shape on the floor, a shape that I first thought was debris, until it moved just slightly enough to force my heart into my throat, and as I approached I saw it was a coat, a heavy dark coat laid out neatly like it had been placed on a body that wasn't there anymore, and something about that careful placement chilled me more than any figure could have, because it suggested intention, it suggested presence. And when I reached down to touch the fabric, it was warm, impossibly warm, as if someone had just taken it off seconds ago. And that was when the lights on my recorder flickered in patterns I had never seen before, pulsing as though syncing with another rhythm in the room, and I realized I wasn't just documenting a scene, I was standing in the middle of one still unfolding, one that had been waiting for a witness. And as the door at the end of the corridor creaked again, a slow, deliberate creak, I understood the real reason the client had looked at me with that mixture of desperation and relief. She hadn't needed me to solve something she already feared the answer to. She needed someone who wouldn't run the moment the building started to breathe, and despite the dread coiling in my stomach, I stepped forward, because turning back now felt more dangerous than continuing, and because some part of me knew that whatever was waiting on the other side of that shifting door wasn't finished, and had no intention of letting me leave without hearing it. When the client first walked into my office 3 days before I found myself in that cursed hallway, she didn't look like someone seeking a detective. She looked like someone fleeing an idea she couldn't shake, and her eyes kept drifting to the corners of the room, as if expecting the walls to shift the same way the walls in that building later would. And she told me her name was Lila Mercer, a name I recognized from old newspaper clippings about a family that had tried to restore a property on the outskirts of the city, a property tied to more rumors than actual records. And as she sat down across from me, clutching a folder so tightly the edges were bent, she explained that her brother Caleb had taken over the restoration project 2 months ago and stopped returning calls 1 week into the work, though the messages she did receive were enough to keep her awake, the kind that weren't pleas for help but fragmented questions about movement in empty rooms and patterns forming in dust, and the feeling of being mirrored by something he couldn't see. And she looked at me and said she needed someone who didn't scare easily, someone who understood that not every case fit neatly into police reports and rational explanations. And she slid the folder across my desk, and inside were photos, grainy and tilted, of corridors with strange marks scratched into the plaster, not symbols but lines that looked like someone dragging their fingers along the walls without stopping. And the last photo was of Caleb standing in a doorway smiling, but his eyes weren't focused on the camera, they were angled to the side, as if tracking someone stepping beside him, someone the camera hadn't caught. And I should have turned down the case because everything about it felt wrong from the start, but the unease in her voice carried something genuine, and I've learned that genuine fear is harder to fake than people think. So I agreed to visit the property, and the next morning I drove out to the edge of town to a building that looked more like a memory than a structure, its facade sagging under decades of abandonment and its windows clouded over like blind eyes. And when I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell of faint metallic scent, like the aftermath of a storm or the inside of an old battery. And the second thing was the quiet, the kind of quiet that feels staged, like a held breath. And as I moved through the atrium, my flashlight captured glints in the dust, tiny reflective fragments scattered across the floor, and when I knelt to examine them, I realized they weren't glass or debris, they were nails, human fingernails, small and brittle, as if shed naturally yet collected intentionally. And as unsettling as it was, it didn't explain Caleb's disappearance, so I kept going, convinced that there had to be a rational thread to pull, and the deeper I walked, the more I noticed the layout of the building didn't make architectural sense. Hallways that should have been straight, bending subtly. Room shifting proportions as if the structure itself was adjusting around me, and when I reached what the floor plans labeled as the east corridor, my recorder picked up a faint rhythmic clicking, something too regular to be natural but too faint to pinpoint, and that was when I found the first door that wouldn't open, not because it was locked, but because it felt as though something was bracing against it from the other side, something without weight but with intention, and I pressed my ear to the wood and heard the soft, almost polite knock 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 in a pattern that matched the clicking on the recorder exactly, and for the first time I allowed the possibility that Caleb hadn't just vanished. He had been followed inside the building by something that understood him, something that maybe even liked him, and that terrifying thought was exactly what pushed me deeper, because if there was any chance he was still alive, or at least still reachable, I had to find out what had taken him and why. The building felt less like a crime scene and more like a living witness, unwilling to stay silent any longer. By the time I reached the central stairwell, I had already abandoned the idea that the building was merely old, because age doesn't rearrange corridors or mimic footsteps with such deliberate timing, and as I climbed the steps the air grew heavier, not thicker, just heavier, like it carried a pressure that made every breath feel accounted for, and the recorder in my hand began flashing again, not irregularly this time, but with a steady pulse like a heartbeat, and the strange part was that the pulse matched my own, as if the device wasn't recording sound anymore, but syncing itself to something internal, and for a moment I stopped and stared at it, wondering if Caleb had stood on these exact steps feeling the same intrusion, and the thought tightened in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving, and at the landing I found something I hadn't expected, a trail of white dust leading from one doorway to another, almost like powdered plaster, except when I touched it between my fingers it felt warm and soft like skin that shouldn't have been powdered at all, and that was when I realized it was shed skin-thin, delicate layers that flaked apart under the slightest pressure, and whatever left it behind had passed through recently, because the dust hadn't yet settled. And as I pushed open the nearest door, the hinges let out a sigh, not a creak, a sigh, an exhale that felt too intentional, and inside was a room that hadn't been on the floor plans, a small study with a desk overturned and the walls covered in streaks of black residue like soot brushed by a hand that didn't leave fingerprints, only smears, and in the center of the room sat a single object, a small handheld radio, the kind construction crews used clipped to a belt, and when I picked it up the static wasn't random, it was breathing, steady, calm human breathing, and I whispered Caleb's name into the receiver, and the breathing paused just long enough to let silence answer, then resumed as if acknowledging me but unwilling to speak, and that tiny hesitation chilled me more than any voice could have, because it meant someone or something was listening and choosing restraint, and I asked aloud what happened in this building, what Caleb had found, what had found him, and the static shifted, forming faint rhythmic strokes like someone dragging a nail across a metal surface slowly, deliberately, and that was when I noticed the marks on the desk, not scratches but shallow grooves forming a pattern, a looping spiral, leading inward, and I felt my stomach tightened, because the spiral wasn't random, it matched the lines Caleb had photographed on the walls days before he vanished, and suddenly everything aligned, the shifting hallways, the warm coat, the faint footsteps. The building wasn't haunted in the traditional sense, it was reacting, responding, imprinting itself on whoever entered, and Caleb must have reached a point where the building stopped watching and started learning him, mimicking him, until the difference blurred, and as I traced the spiral with my fingertips, a jolt of recognition shot through me, not memory, but sensation, like stepping into someone else's dream halfway through, and in that instant I understood why the door in the east corridor had been held shut. Something on the other side wasn't trying to keep me out, it was waiting for me to come in, and with that realization came the flash of direction, the sudden clarity investigators call an epiphany, but this felt more like a nudge from something aware of my presence and guiding it, and I followed the spiral's implied path back into the hall, down 2 flights, and across a corridor that didn't exist before yet somehow felt familiar, and at the end of it was a door I hadn't seen earlier, a narrow wooden frame with peeling white paint, and when I touched the handle the recorder in my pocket stopped pulsing completely, as if holding its breath with me, and I pushed the door open and stepped inside, expecting darkness, but instead found a room lit with a faint bluish glow. And in the center of that glow stood a figure, not solid, not fully visible, but outlined in shifting fragments, as if someone had taken the idea of a human shape and led it over a flickering projection, and even before it turned I knew who it resembled, and why this room felt like the end of a trail I wasn't sure I wanted to finish. The figure didn't look at me so much as through me, its outline stuttering like it was being drawn and erased at the same time, and as I stepped closer the bluish light flickered with a rhythm that almost resembled thought, and in that trembling silhouette I recognized the proportions, the tilt of the head, the slight slouch Caleb had in every photo his sister showed me, and the realization landed not like shock but like confirmation, because some part of me already knew. This was where the trail would end, not with a body, but with an imprint and echo shaped by the building itself, and when I said his name the figure responded not with movement but with distortion, its edges rippling as if my voice pushed against it, and for a brief moment the flicker synced with my breathing the way the recorder had earlier, and I understood then that the building wasn't trying to mimic Caleb, it was trying to preserve him, or at least preserve the version of him it had absorbed. And the realization hit me harder than any horror. This place wasn't a trap, it was a memory engine taking what entered and rewriting it into itself room by room, moment by moment, until the boundary between person and structure dissolved. And as I stood there the air shifted, carrying that same metallic scent I noticed in the atrium, and the walls around me began to flex subtly like muscle responding to a heartbeat, and I knew I had only seconds before the building tried to take something from me too, so I spoke quickly, telling the figure that Lila was looking for him, telling whatever consciousness existed here that I understood this wasn't malice but instinct, a kind of preservation gone wrong, and for the first time since I entered the building the figure reacted. It leaned just slightly, emotion too human to be accidental, and its outline flickered in a way that felt like effort, like it was trying to hold shape against the building's influence, and in that strained flicker I saw a final, clear frame, Caleb's face pale, focused, frightened but aware, and his lips moved silently, forming a single word that I couldn't hear but didn't need to, because the message pressed into my mind with a clarity no sound could match. Leave. And the moment that word settled in my head the room snapped, the bluish glow collapsed into darkness, and the floor shuddered under my feet as if the building itself exhaled, and I ran not because panic took over but because instinct finally snapped free, urging me down the corridor, through the shifting hallways which no longer tried to guide me but seemed to close behind me, erasing each path as I passed, and by the time I reached the entrance the metallic scent had faded, replaced by a dull emptiness like waking from a dream too heavy to shake off, and when I stepped outside into the cold night air the silence that followed felt clean, unclaimed, unobserved, and I didn't realize how tightly I had been gripping my recorder until my fingers ached, and when I looked at the device the pulsing light was gone, replaced by a single steady glow, as if confirming the end of the transmission. Whatever had been syncing with it was no longer reaching outward, and I drove straight to Lila's apartment, rehearsing how to tell her the truth without giving her false hope. And when she opened the door and saw my face, she didn't ask whether I found him, she asked whether he suffered, and I told her he wasn't alone, that he had fought, that he had left a message meant to protect her, and she nodded through tears, gripping the edge of the doorway to steady herself, and I realized then that the building hadn't taken Caleb out of cruelty, it had taken him because he had stayed long enough to be understood, and in its own warped way imitated. And when I filed my report later that night I didn't mention the figure or the spiral or the breathing static, because no official record would accept what I witnessed. Instead I wrote that the structure was unstable, unsafe, unsalvageable, and recommended it be sealed permanently. And as I finished the report I caught a faint reflection on the surface of my desk, not my reflection but a second one just over my shoulder, flickering for a moment like a memory trying to hold on, and then fading before I could turn. And now, even days later, I can still feel the building lingering at the edge of thought, like a place that learned me too well and waits quietly for the moment I decide to return.